This is lecture 11 in Psych 3272, and our topic this week is attraction and sex. I'm going to be talking about the initial stages of attraction and in this particular lecture. And then the next lecture, I'm going to be focusing more on love and long-term relationships and even friendships. So this is much more about sort of the initial steps of attraction from a social neuroscience perspective. All right, let's start with a paper that's kind of a highly cited paper by this point in time. It was published in 2004, and you can see it's Stephen Hammond and his colleagues, and it's called Men and Women Differ in Amygdala Response to Visual Sexual Stimuli. I put this up because this is one of the first fMRI studies that reported sexual attraction, looking at in the brain what parts of the brain might be active when people are looking at stimuli that they find sexually attractive. Now, in this particular paper, there had already been some research conducted prior to this study, and they had found in these other studies that the amygdala seemed to be involved in how people processed sexual attraction. And in this particular paper by Hammond et al., they wanted to test two hypotheses that they thought had developed in the literature by that point about this. And so they were actually looking at sex differences, the difference between men and women in terms of their sexual responsiveness to stimuli. So they had these two hypotheses. One was that they said some of the literature suggested that if there is a difference between men and women, it might have to do with the fact that men get more aroused sexually than women do when they're looking at sexual stimuli. And so by looking at that hypothesis, you would just suggest if you were measuring arousal that men would report finding stimuli more arousing than women would. And so what they thought they could do in this particular study is control for that by making sure that the stimuli that they showed to their participants were rated equally in arousal. So that is, they're going to find specific stimuli that can show to both men and women that men and women equally rate as arousing. So that way we can control for arousal and not say that it's arousal that's actually the explanation. The other hypothesis that they tested was what they called the processing mode hypothesis. And this specifically says that if there are sex differences in the way that men and women process sexual stimuli, it's because men have developed a certain way of processing sexual stimuli that uses specific brain regions that you won't see are activated when a woman processes sexual stimuli. So they're saying that there's a difference in the way men and women process sexual stimuli, such that men might have special areas of the brain that become more active that you don't see in women. That was their other hypothesis that they were testing. And I can just tell you the way their logic worked in this paper is they thought if they could rule out the arousal hypothesis, that would only leave the processing mode hypothesis. Although they also mention in the introduction that there's a possibility that it could be a combination of those two hypotheses. But again, if you can rule out the arousal hypothesis, then it couldn't be a combination. So that's the logic behind this particular study, and I have made it available as a recommended reading if you want to read the actual study. But here's what they did. They had men and women look at pictures of sexual stimuli involving either heterosexual couples involved in sexual activity or opposite sex others. So they presumably only had heterosexual men and women in the study, looking at heterosexual couples and opposite sex attractive people who I believe even the people by themselves, that opposite sex others, were sexually attractive photographs. And they also had some neutral photographs. Another category of pictures there were just neutral pictures that had nothing to do with sexuality. And so what the participant would do is they would be in the scanner and they would make ratings of attractiveness and how arousing they found the photos. So again, they had purposely picked these pictures to be comparable in arousal levels for men and women. But there could be differences in attractiveness, how attractive men and women find these particular pictures. So what we can do is look at how they rated the couples versus how they rated the opposite sex stimuli. So the white bars represent the couples stimuli, and the gray bars represent just a single person who's the opposite sex to the participant. And the women are on the left and the male participants are on the right. And by the way, there was about 28 participants in the study, so about 14 men, 14 women. And so what you can see on the attractiveness is that there was this effect for, it looks like that the women find couples more attractive than the opposite sex pictures, but it turns out that that difference wasn't actually significant. The only real difference here is that overall, participants rate the couples as looking more sexually attractive than the opposite sex individuals. So you can see that generally speaking, the white bars are higher than the gray bars for both men and women. Now, in terms of arousal, you can see there that again, couples look more arousing to our participants in this study, but that the opposite sex don't seem to give much arousal. And the key thing here is to notice that men and women are comparably rating the arousal. Although, again, it looks like the women are finding the couples more arousing, much more arousing than the opposite sex. There's no difference there. It's significant from the way that the men are seeing couples versus opposite sex. That could be partly explained, by the way, by the low sample size. So keep in mind that the power of this particular study is low, and by today's standards in 2018, I'd want to have that replicated just to show that, in fact, that there really wasn't a difference here between the women and the men. But then, of course, you'd have to do the whole fMRI study, and then it would cost a lot more money. Anyway, let's go to the fMRI data. Now, in those previous studies that had just been done in the couple years before this 2004 paper, they had, in the other studies, had found that the amygdala was what seemed to be particularly activated for men when they looked at sexual stimuli. And so they wanted to look at bilateral amygdala here, and they also looked at the hypothalamus because the hypothalamus had been found in some studies to also be activated to sexual stimuli. So here's what they see in their percent signal change in the fMRI bold signal. And the white bars here this time represent the male participants, and the dark bars represent the female participants. And then you can see we have the left amygdala first, and we're looking at the couple stimuli versus the opposite sex stimuli versus the neutral stimuli. And one key thing to pay attention to right there that's highlighted is that men find the couples, it's activating their left amygdala a lot more than it is when females look at couples. So the males have much greater activation in the left amygdala than women do. And in fact, if you even look across there, you can see that the men are showing the most activation in the left amygdala for couples compared to the opposite sex and the neutral. The same kind of pattern happens over here in the right amygdala, in that, again, men have higher activation in the right amygdala for pictures of couples than women do. So women aren't showing the same level of activation for the couple stimuli as men are. And again, men do this more than they do for opposite sex or neutral photos. And then finally, in the hypothalamus, we also get a significant difference here between men and women, that male participants show more activation in the hypothalamus for couples than they do for the opposite sex. Than females do for those same stimuli, and also for opposite sex. Although actually I don't think that's a significant difference between couples and opposite sex for the males. The only real kind of thing that happened with the women is you notice that they showed their most activation for the left amygdala to opposite sex people, although even though it's trending in that direction, that there's more activity in their left amygdala for opposite sex, it's not actually significantly different for couples or neutral. So the key thing to really get from looking at those three things, especially the parts that I've highlighted, is that they did find a gender difference or a sex difference in their participants between male and female participants in how they saw couples in particular. And so the couples activated left and right amygdala and the hypothalamus more in the male participants than those stimuli did in the female participants. And so again, assuming that there's no differences in arousal for males and females, they want to then argue that the arousal hypothesis can be dismissed, and that just leaves you the processing mode hypothesis, that perhaps men, because of their evolutionary history, are responding to these couple sexual stimuli differently than females do. There's something about the way they process those stimuli. If you go to that paper's discussion section, you can see a little bit about what they say here. They say here, sex differences in activations to sexual stimuli could arise from differences in processing mode between men and women. That's the second hypothesis. From activations related to higher arousal, irrespective of biological sex, or from a combination of those factors. By the arousal hypothesis, when men and women are matched on levels of illicit arousal, sex difference in brain activation should be eliminated. In contrast, the processing mode hypothesis predicts that men should still show greater brain activation than women in specific regions after controlling for arousal. Our present results support the second hypothesis. In addition, the highly localized nature of the sex differences is more consistent with the processing mode hypothesis. Previous studies contrasting brain responses to affectively positive visually stimuli with those to less arousing stimuli consistently report arousal-related activations distributed across multiple regions. This stands in marked contrast to the localized differences found here. So they really are trying to claim, based on this one study published in 2004, that men really do process sexual stimuli different from women. And that's because they say, because the participants rated the arousal levels equally, they mean they controlled for the arousal, and the only real difference then is just that men process those pictures differently. Now, a couple things to kind of note about that. I think there's some limitations you need to think about. I've already mentioned the sample size, so we don't know if the lack of differences in some of those self-report measures could be due to low power, and for that matter, maybe some more things would have been significant in the brain that way as well. The other thing is just this whole idea that they feel like they've matched or controlled for arousal through self-reports. If you kind of look down here in the bottom, the part that I have highlighted in yellow, I'm just going to blow it up a little bit. You can see here they talk about some other studies that left arousal being different for men and women. And they say here that after controlling for arousal, the only sex difference observed was in the hypothalamus, that it was in the hypothalamus was eliminated in that previous study. But they say in our study, reported arousal was equated for females and males. Moreover, when one female subject in the current study reported low arousal ratings for the couple stimuli was excluded from the analysis, the reported arousal was greater for females than males. What they're saying is they had one sort of outlier here among their 14 women, a woman who really didn't think the couple stimuli looked very arousing, and even when you remove hers then you would actually have a significant difference, a much higher level of arousal for the women. They would find those couple stimuli more arousing. That's the thing that's kind of interesting, is that even though the participants rate that the women rated that they found those couples pictures more arousing, they're not showing the same sort of amygdala activation that the men are. Now, the whole idea that the amygdala might be involved in this just has to do with the idea that it's perhaps the amygdala is activated because of the significance of the stimuli. So maybe men, and this argument would be that men, when they see images of sex happening between a man and a woman, that somehow that's more significant to them, that kind of makes the brain more alert, pay more attention, and would cause sort of appetitive behavior where the person would want to approach that scene so the man could be part of that particular scene. Whereas women supposedly don't process those same kinds of images that way, and so therefore they don't see it as significant and therefore don't want to approach it. It doesn't seem to jibe very well with their self-reports here, but because it's fMRI and this is an early study in this area, that's kind of like considered, this particular piece of evidence was considered more persuasive because of the brain activity. And I just bring this whole study up to you just to kind of give you an idea of some of the challenges of looking at this kind of research in an fMRI scanner. Having people lie on their backs and watching sexual stimuli, rating how arousing, how attractive they find it, how their brain's going to respond to it. Maybe while a male experimenter is testing you in the lab, may also have had some impact on the participant. It could have been, for instance, that women didn't feel so comfortable in that particular situation looking at erotic stimuli, and that's why their amygdalas weren't activated, whereas maybe men feel more comfortable having a male experimenter in this kind of situation. Who knows? Those kinds of differences weren't really assessed in this study, and they're just things that you'd want to follow up if you were, I think, interested in this particular area. So I bring that study up, this Hammond et al. Study from 2004, as sort of like a representative study that's been done with brain imaging to look at these initial stages of attraction that we have for one another. Now, before we go much more into the data, I also want to go ahead and just highlight some theories that are sort of relevant to human sexual behavior, particularly from an evolutionary point of view. So let's look at some theories from biology and from evolutionary psychology that might have some role in giving us an idea of what we can expect when we look at the social neuroscience of attraction. So one theory that I think is important to bring up is the theory of inclusive fitness that was proposed by Hamilton back in 1964. And what this theory says is that natural selection, and this is from a perspective of evolution, will will favor features that increase the chances of genes being passed, whether or not the individual is the ancestor, aka kin selection. So what this is saying is that not only do we want to pass our own genes on directly to our offspring, but according to the theory of inclusive fitness, we're also going to want to make sure that anybody who's related to us, who has some gene overlap with our own genes, we're going to prefer taking care of those people and helping them reach the point where they can pass their genes on because they share some genes with us than, for instance, a complete stranger does. And so this is also known as kin selection. Here's an example. This is an older example from the 1990s. This is called the Cinderella Effect. And the theory here is that men should give more resources to their genetic children than they do to their stepchildren. And the reason would be because their genetic children are sharing genes with them, of course. And theory of inclusive fitness would say then that father is going to want to be more helpful and so on with somebody who they're genetically related to than they would be to a stepchild who they don't share any genetic overlap with. So the way you can look at the Cinderella effect is this study that was done by Anderson et al. Back in 1999, where they looked at the odds that a man would give financial support to children who were attending college, going off to university. And these children were classified into one of four types. So you can look to see whether or not the man is the child's genetic father or the man is the child's stepfather. And then you can see whether or not the child's mother is the man's current partner. So this is like the child's mother and the child's father are together. The child's mother is the man's previous partner. So this means that the man is the father, but he's no longer with the mother. That's class 2. Class 3 is when you have a child who is the step-parent, a stepchild of the step-parent for the father, and their mother is still there and is married to that stepfather or with the stepfather. And then the class 4 would be the child's mother is the man's previous partner and the man is the child's stepfather. So it'd be like the relationship ended and this guy who was the stepfather is no longer married or still involved with the mother of that child who was their stepchild. That would be class 4. And so what Anderson et al. Did, like I said, they wanted to look to see if these different classes differed and how much support they offered a child who goes off to university. And these are odds ratios where you can see that class 2, which again is the child's mother's with the man's previous partner, is the man's previous partner, so they're no longer together, but the man is the child's genetic father. That's the line going across there. So the guy is genetically related to his child, but he's no longer with the mother. That's the line, and you can see that class 1, where it's the genetic child and they're still with the mother, that gets a lot more help. That's a significant difference from class 2. But notice what happens when we get to class 3 or class 4. There's a lot less help here. So step 3 isn't a whole lot different from class 2, but class 4 is certainly significantly different from class 2. So what this is trying to argue then is that we're more likely to then help people who are genetically related to us, like these fathers are to their genetic child, than they are to their stepchildren. So that's the theory of inclusive fitness. Now, another theory that's relevant here would be the sexual selection theory of Darwin, who talked about this a few times. He talked about both intrasexual competition and intersexual selection, and that has to do with things that we do compete within our own sex for mates, so things that males might compete with other males or females compete with other females, or intersexual selection would mean that there are pressures or characteristics that might attract the opposite sex for mating purposes. So there's going to be both intersexual competition and intersexual selection. And then we're also going to have parental investment theory that was proposed by Trivers, and that basically argues that the sex that invests more in the offspring should be choosier about potential mates. And so this would be, for instance, that maybe In humans, because women have to invest a lot more in their offspring than men do, they're going to be choosier about who they want to mate with than men are going to be. Now that kind of leads us to this phenomenon known as the Coolidge Effect. And keep in mind as I explain this that maybe this could explain some of the Hammond et al. Data about why men are more excited or whatever about that couple sexual stimuli than the women are. Now, this Coolidge Effect goes back to this joke that is kind of famous, having to do with a president, Calvin Coolidge. And you can look this up in Wikipedia. But basically what it says is that there was this American president named Calvin Coolidge, and his wife visited a poultry farm together as part of his presidency. And they were being shown separately around the farm when Mrs. Coolidge came to a chicken yard and noticed that a rooster was mating very frequently. And she asked the attendant how often that happened and was told dozens of times each day. Mrs. Coolidge then joked, "Tell that to the president when he comes by." All right, so they're separate. Now the president's going to come by a little bit later. And so the president, when he heard this information, asked the farmer, "Does each rooster service the same hen each time?" "No," replied the farmer. "There are many hens for each rooster." And then, "Perhaps you could point that out to Mrs. Coolidge," replied the president. So that's the joke, right? And it turns out that this is a real phenomenon at least in farming. So the idea here is that the frequency of sex for males is positively correlated with the number of available partners. So a lot of different farm animals will mate frequently if they're given a variety of partners to have. But does this work with humans? Well, how would you really assess that? One thing you can do is you can kind of ask men and women how much they desire having other partners. So here's a study that Glenn Wilson published back in 1989, and the question had to do with, you can see there's lots of men and women that are being asked about their ideal sex life here. And the question is, well, if you're not getting enough sex at the moment, if that wasn't enough, then your ideal would be, and so they're kind of saying, okay, you're stuck with the situation where you're not getting enough sex. What would you like to do to solve that problem? A, have more sex with your spouse or your steady partner. Now you can see that those are percentages of men, either under the age of 30 or over 30, that say, yes, that's what I'd want to do. So you can see for men, it's around 38% of the men say, yeah, I'm not getting enough sex, I'd like to have more sex with my spouse or my steady partner. For women, it's more like 62 or 63%. Now, another option was, well, maybe if you're not getting enough sex at the moment, the ideal would be to have more exciting variations with your partner. And you can see that this time it's about the same for men, 34 to 38%. For women, it's a lot less, 24 to 26% of these women say if that were the case, they wouldn't really want to have more exciting variations with a partner. But then look at this one. One of the things you could do if you're not getting enough sex, you could go ahead and try to have more partners. And you can see that men, this is around 38, 37% again. So men, more than a third of them say they would like to have more partners, but this is actually the lowest category for women. So women don't desire having more partners when they would like to have more sex. So this is sort of evidence from the human level of the Coolidge effect. Now, we can look at all of this stuff in terms of all of these things that I talked about from an evolutionary psychology point of view. And what I want to do next is show you a little video where you're going to see two famous social psychologists, David Buss and Alice Egley, talking about their perspectives on this and how they both view the issues of human sexual attraction. So I'll show you this video of Buss and then Egley, and then I'll talk to you more about Buss's approach.
Sexual motivation enables species survival. Attraction is the first step. In non-human species, hormones activate the mating process. Mating strategies are not particularly variable. Males often compete aggressively for dominance over more than one female. We humans each owe our existence to the attraction between a particular man and a particular woman. Everywhere, people show preferences for certain romantic partners. But what shapes those preferences? Are they universal?
preferences?
Do all
Are they
people look for the
universal?
same qualities in
Do
a
all
potential
people
mate?
look for the same qualities in a
Theorists
potential
disagree
mate?
on the role that evolution and
Theorists
culture
disagree
play
on the
in
role
social
that evolution
attraction.
and culture play in
Dr.
social
David Buss is a
attraction.
proponent of an
Dr. David
evolutionary
Buss is a
explanation.
proponent of an evolutionary
Evolutionary psychology
explanation.
makes a very powerful
Evolutionary
set of
psychology
predictions
makes a very
about sex
powerful
differences in
set
mating
of predictions
strategies.
about
These
sex
stem
differences in
from
mating strategies.
fundamental
These
sex
stem
differences
from
in human
fundamental
reproductive
sex
biology.
differences in
I'll
human
mention just
reproductive
two.
biology.
One is the
I'll
fact that
mention just
fertilization
two.
occurs
One is the
internally
fact
within
that
women
fertilization
and not
occurs
within
internally
men.
within
And this has
women
posed a
and
very
not
important
within
adaptive
men.
problem
And this has
for
posed a
men,
very important
namely the
adaptive
problem of
for
paternity
men,
uncertainty.
namely the problem of
Some cultures
paternity
use the phrase
uncertainty.
mama's baby,
Some cultures
papa's
use the
maybe
phrase
to
mama's
describe
baby,
this
papa's
asymmetry
maybe
there.
to
Men are never
describe this
sure whether they're the
asymmetry there.
fathers. Women
Men
are
are never
always
sure whether they're the
100% sure.
fathers. Women
A
are
second
always
major difference in
100%
reproductive
sure.
biology
A second
is
major
what
difference
is
in
called the
reproductive
minimum
biology
obligatory
is called the
parental
minimum
investment. If
obligatory
we ask the question, how
parental
much
investment
does a
If we
man or
ask
a
the
woman
question,
need
how much
to put in
investment
to
does a
produce a
man or a
single
woman
child?
need to
In the
put in
woman's
to
case,
produce a
it's
single
tremendous.
child?
That
In the woman's
9-month
case,
period
it's
of
tremendous.
pregnancy,
That
it's
9-month
metabolically
period of
costly,
pregnancy, it's
and
metabolically
this is a
costly,
tremendous cost that is not
this is a
borne by men.
tremendous
And
cost
so
that is not
these sex
borne by
differences
men.
in fundamental
And so
aspects of
these
human
sex
reproductive
differences in
biology
fundamental aspects of
have
human
given
reproductive
rise
biology,
to psychological
have
sex
given
differences.
rise to
Dr. Alice
psychological
Egley
sex
is a
differences.
proponent of the
Dr.
social
Alice
structural
Egley is a
theory.
proponent of the
She
social
looks at mate
structural
selection
theory.
from a different
She
perspective.
looks at mate selection from a different
We
perspective.
choose partners,
We choose
our long-term partners, in the constraints of the role system that we have, particularly the marital role system. So one would, as a woman, want a man who would do a good job of however the male, the father, husband role is defined in the society, and a man similarly would want a woman to do a good job of however it's defined in society. So we're looking for good exemplars in terms of the marital role system and the broader gender role system that's apparent in our society.
Buss believes his evolutionary theory finds support in a study of 37 different cultures around the world. He and his colleagues simply asked men and women what they preferred in a mate. They discovered remarkable similarities across these differing cultures.
What we found is there was one particular cluster in all 37 cultures that women valued more than men. It's what I call the resource cluster. Basically, women universally more than men valued partners who had good financial prospects, who were economically stable, and even more important, who had the personality characteristics that lead to resources and resource acquisition over time. These are things like a man's ambition, drive, industriousness, social status, and even older age, somewhat older age. Women typically want partners who are 3 to 4 years older than they are, and we know that statistically a somewhat older age is linked with greater resources and greater social status. We found one very powerful sex difference, something that men wanted more than women. Basically boils down to two characteristics. One is things associated with youth, and the other is things associated with physical appearance or physical attractiveness. These are obviously related. Physical appearance provides a wealth of information about a woman's fertility or reproductive value, that is, her ability to have children in the future. And men who, in our evolutionary past, who selected fertile women, they out-reproduced men who tended to select infertile women. And so men's mate preferences focus heavily on physical appearance cues to fertility. So things like clear skin, a youthful appearance, lustrous hair, full lips, symmetrical features, signs of good health, signs of youth. These are things that men value more than women.
It's built into the species, you should see it pretty much every place. So my colleague Wendy Wood and I were interested in that, and we looked at the data from the 37 culture study. It appeared to us that there was a fair amount of variability across the 37 cultures in the extent to which you get sex differentiated mate selection. And
make
our
selection.
thought was that, well,
And
that
our
should
thought
follow
was
some
that,
rules, the
well,
rules of the
that
social
should follow
structural
some
theory.
rules, the rules
That
of the
is, when
social
men and women are
structural
very
theory.
differently
That
placed in
is, when
social
men and
roles,
women
they
are
should
very
choose rather
differently placed
differently.
in social roles,
So
they
there's
should choose
a
rather
strong
differently.
division of labor
So
between
there's a
homemakers and
strong
providers,
division of
and the
labor
women are really
between
confined to the
homemakers and
home.
providers, and the
Then you
women are
should
really
get
confined
big
to the
differences in
home.
mate selection.
Then you should
And
get
in other
big
kinds of
differences in
societies,
mate
such as
selection.
our own,
And
where
in
these
other kinds of
differences have
societies, such as
moderated to
our
some
own, where
extent,
these
most women
differences
are
have moderated
employed,
to
men
some
and women
extent,
aren't
most
so
women are
differently
employed,
placed,
men and
then
women
the
aren't so
sex differences in mate
differently
selection should get
placed, then
smaller
the sex
because they're due
differences
to
in
the
mate
placement of
selection
men and
should get
women
smaller
in
because they're
different
due to the
roles in
placement of men and
society.
women in
Egley
different
obtained
roles in
data from the
society.
United Nations on
Egley
gender
obtained data
equality.
from the United Nations on
These
gender
studies compared
equality.
men and women in various
These studies
societies
compared men and
according to
women
the
in
division
various
of labor.
societies according to
She
the
found
division
enough
of labor.
variation in the results
She
to
found enough
suggest that
variation in
sex
the results
differences in
to
mate
suggest
selection tend
that
to
sex
erode
differences
in
in mate
cultures in
selection
which there
tend
is
to
greater
erode
gender
in
equality.
cultures in which there is greater
The more
gender
similar the
equality.
roles of men and women,
The more
the more
similar
people
the
tend to
roles of
choose
men and
someone
women,
like
the more people
themselves.
tend to
Good
choose
morning,
someone
Vanilla
like
Industries.
themselves.
Good
The
morning,
debate
Vanilla
over gender
Industries.
differences in mate
The
preferences
debate over gender
raises the
differences in
larger
mate
issue of the
preferences
relative
raises the
contributions of
larger
biology
issue of the
and
relative
culture to
contributions
human
of
social
biology and
behavior.
culture to
Such
human
accounts
social
need not be
behavior.
contradictory.
Such accounts need
Indeed,
not be
biology and
contradictory.
culture interact.
Indeed, biology
Biological
and culture
factors
interact.
operate within a cultural
Biological
context,
factors operate
and
within a
culture
cultural
builds on a
context.
biological
And
foundation.
culture builds on a biological
Proponents of the various
foundation.
theories of attraction and mate
Proponents of the
selection
various theories of
continue their
attraction
quest.
and mate selection
Their work may
continue their
ultimately
quest.
lead to a theory
Their work
that
may
integrates
ultimately lead to a
biological,
theory that
psychological,
integrates
and social
biological,
factors.
psychological, and social factors.
All right, so that theory that they're referring to, sexual strategies theory, is already over 25 years old, and there's plenty of research that's been done in those years since it was originally proposed, and there's been plenty of debate, plenty of critics of the theory. I only present it to you at this point because I think it's kind of a good way to frame some of the questions that you could look at from a social neuroscience perspective about attraction and, particularly about sexual attraction. And so we'll kind of evaluate some of these aspects of the theory by looking at some of the data, but this isn't meant to be a comprehensive critical review of this particular theory. So the theory does predict that you'll have intrasexual and intersexual selection. And so these intersexual selection pressures that come from Darwin's theory is that you'll have specialized signals that appeal to the opposite sex. And there'll be these signals that indicate that the animal is going to be a good parent and signals that indicate good genes. And so one of the things you'll see then is that women and men are going to differ in terms of those signals about whether or not they're a good parent, whether they'll be able to give birth, that kind of thing. The other thing that we have to think about is how men are also competing to get attraction from the women. And the women, therefore, remember, women can be kind of choosy because they have more parental investment. Men, therefore, are constrained in their reproduction by the number of women that are willing to mate with them. When they face four problems, according to Buss. They're trying to maximize the number of partners because the more partners they can have, the more chance they can pass on their genes. They want to identify which women are accessible, and they're trying to identify which are fertile. And they're also trying to minimize their commitment and investment with any particular partner so they can keep moving on and find another partner to possibly impregnate. Okay. Now, of course, this theory says that that's what they're faced with. So it means that women are actually constraining them on those things, and so most men are not actually going to be showing all those particular things going on. But still, we can kind of look at the data and see if there's anything about the way men and women report how they look for potential mates that might back up this theory. And so over the years, Buss has provided some data in this way where he's tested large numbers of undergraduates, mainly at the University of Texas at Austin, where he asks them questions like this, like, in your lifetime, how many partners would you like to have? Sexual partners. Now, you can ask this in different time frames. You could say, like, in 1 month, how many partners would you like to have? How many partners would you like to have in a year? How many partners would you like to have in the next 5 years? And so on. And what you can see here is a definite sex difference, that men are more likely to say that they would like to have a higher number of partners at any time interval. The closest they come to is just in the next month, but you can see at 1 year, they're already saying they like to have 6 or 7 partners. Women are still down there around 1. And then in the course of their lifetime, females say they like to have 5 or 6 partners, but men are already well over 20 or so, wanting to have 20 or so partners. So already you can see that men would like to have more partners than women would. What about the likelihood to consent to sexual intercourse after having known an attractive member of the opposite sex for different periods of time? This question kind of gets at the minimal time and investment kind of thing. So you remember, men, according to the theory, don't want to spend very much time and investment. They just want to go ahead and get right to it in terms of having a chance of passing on their genes. So we should see some sex differences in how much it takes before you are likely to have sexual intercourse. And that's actually what you see in this particular data set. Again, just sampling students at the University of Texas at Austin. And you can see that if I start with the lower right corner down and say, you've only known this person for an hour, what's the chances that you're going to have sex? You can see for females, the y-axis is just the likelihood of this actually happening. It's very unlikely for a woman to say yes after 1 hour, but you can see men is already much higher. And if we keep going to 1 evening, 1 day, 1 week, women are hardly changing at all. Men keep increasing the chances they'd like to have sex with this person. Finally, it takes about 1 month before a woman's really going to change in terms of the likelihood of wanting to consent to sexual intercourse compared to men who are already much higher than that. And it's only when you get to around 5 years or so that the chances of sexual intercourse are equal for men and women, according to this particular study. Now, the way that he did do this study to test sexual strategies theory, it was talked about in the video. And back in 1990, they surveyed 9,500 people in 37 different cultures. And one of those cultures was actually in Australia. They did some surveying here at the University of Queensland. And what they did is they would ask all their participants in these different cultures to rate how important or desirable it was to have each of these 18 qualities for choosing a mate. And so there were 18 different things you could decide how important it was. Like, how important is it that they have a dependable character? How important is it they have chastity or that they're a virgin? How important is it they have good health? Now, when they look across all of those characteristics, there was a lot of variation of how important it was. And Alice Egley actually talked about that. We do know that there was about a 2.4% of the variation was due to the gender, men versus women. But across the cultures, there was about 14% of the variability in these choices was due to the culture. So, in fact, 7 times more of the variability was due to culture than it was to gender. But because sexual strategy theory is just focusing on the gender difference, the sex difference, that's all that Bus then talked about for the rest of the article. So just keep that in mind. The culture is having a huge contribution here to the answer to what is important, but sexual strategies theory only really pays attention to the sex difference. So for instance, here's some data from that study. You can see here that how important is it that your partner has had no previous sexual intercourse. And you can see females versus males. So that's the female versus male participants. In China, you can see that this is very important for males and females, at least back in that 1990 study. You can see for Palestinian Arabs, it's more important for males than it is for females. In the US and Sweden, not so important. In Sweden, in fact, there's like really no difference at all. How about good financial prospects? We can see that across these 5 different countries that are portrayed in this graph, that it's very important for women. It's much higher, more important for women than it is for men. Even there's the Australian sample. You can see that in Australia, it was more important for women to think that their partner had good financial prospects than it was for men to think that about their partner. How about the age difference? Now, you remember that's something that David Buss talked about. He said that they generally women prefer somebody slightly older than them. And you can see here, this is again sort of representative across the different samples in the study. And you can see that, yes, about 4 or 5 years difference was important for women to have a man older than them. You can see the bars going down is what men's preference is for their partner, and they would prefer to have a younger partner. In Zambia in particular, they'd like to have a partner who's like 7 years younger than them. But in the other countries, it's more like 3 or 4 years difference. This age difference thing about how old your partner is. Just recently was in the news again, and a new paper that was published in Science Advances in August of 2018. And you can see the title is Aspirational Pursuit of Mates in Online Dating Markets by Bruch and Newman. And what Bruch and Newman did is they actually looked at a large amount of online dating data that they had access to look at who received the most attention, who were the most desirable people in these very large samples of participants that they had. And you can go ahead and read the study yourself. There's a lot of interesting findings in there, but I wanted to focus on the age aspects of this. So you can see what we have are 4 major cities in the United States where they looked at the data. They have New York, Boston, Chicago, and Seattle. And across those 4 cities, we see the same sorts of trends in terms of who's the most desirable in terms of age. And so the higher the line is on the y-axis, the more that's a desirable quality for the opposite sex. So you can see that women who are like around 18 or 20 are the most desirable, and then as their ages go up, they're less desirable. For men, you can see that their overall age keeps going up from the age of 18, and it peaks at actually around the age of 50. So this is kind of suggesting then that women, as they go from 18 to higher ages, they're less desirable. Now, evolutionary theory or sexual strategies theory would argue that's because the women might be seen as being less fertile, less able to bear children, might not be as healthy. Why would men be more desirable as they get older? Because perhaps they have more resources available to them so they can take care of their offspring. In fact, this is kind of what Bruch and Newman say here. They say, as shown in Figure 2, average desirability varies with age for both men and women, although it varies more strongly for women, and the effects run in opposite directions. Older women are less desirable, while older men are more so. For women, this pattern holds over the full range of ages on the site. The average woman's desirability drops from the time she is 18 until she is 60. For men, desirability peaks around 50 and then declines. So that's just a newer study that kind of supports some of these ideas that would come from sexual strategies theory. But in 1990, back many years ago, Buss did summarize his findings from his big 37 cultures study. And he said there were these 2 clusters that men tend to value in their opposite sex potential partners, youth, beauty, and health, whereas women valued the earnings potential, the ambition of their potential partners, and their industriousness. And he concluded that men seek women who are best able to produce healthy offspring, whereas women seek men who will be best able to care long-term for them and their children. Now, this idea that men and women are interested in different things is something that, again, the evolutionary psychologists have spent a lot of time and effort on, and this particular graphic sort of makes sort of fun of this. It kind of shows you some of the characteristics that men and women are interested in each other. So the guy on the left and the woman on the right are considered to be highly desirable, highly attractive, and you can see that she has large eyes, small nose, a delicate jaw, firm symmetrical breasts, smooth unblemished skin, a waist-to-hip ratio of 0.7, whereas he's supposed to have a prominent brow, a strong chin, a large jaw, slightly above average upper body musculature, and so on, and a lot of wrist and ankle symmetry. The symmetry is the idea behind that, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few slides from now, is that symmetry is a sign of good health, that you've had good neural development, and because of your good, excellent development, then you're going to have more likely to have healthy children, is the argument, and why we value symmetry. Let's move on a little bit now and talk more about attractiveness itself and what we kind of know from the psychology literature and also from neuroscience about what we find more attractive. Now, if you look at these 2 faces, and I say to you, which face is more attractive? Most people would actually pick the picture on the left. They're the same person. The picture's just been distorted a little bit differently from the left and the right due to an algorithm. And what it's done is it's made the one on the left more of a high testosterone face, okay? And we'll talk more about what that is. So the question is there an advantage for people who have high testosterone faces? You see, testosterone is this hormone that's mainly behind muscles, strong jaws, prominent eyebrow ridges, facial hair, and deep voices. So men who have higher testosterone levels are going to show those kinds of features in their faces and in their voices. And the other thing about testosterone is an immunosuppressive. And this would mean that a man must be healthy and in good condition to withstand its effects on his development. So basically, the higher testosterone levels are, the more likely you are to get sick. If the man isn't sick and he has high testosterone, it's kind of a good sign that he's actually very healthy. Testosterone is also linked to other traits related to strength, like fitness, fertility, and dominance. So it could be that the reason why people find men with high testosterone faces more attractive is because of these, uh, um, because it signals these other aspects, these other characteristics about men. But there is also a downside to having men with high testosterone. And just as an example of this, you can see the study by Mazur and Mikulek from 1998. And what they did is they studied 2,100 men in the U.S. Air Force and who had been veterans of the U.S. Air Force. And these, what they did in particular is they identified the men who had testosterone levels that were one standard deviation above the mean. So these are men who had pretty high testosterone levels, around the 95th percentile. And what they found was that 43% of them were more likely to get divorced than men with normal levels. So these men with high testosterone levels are more likely to get divorced. 31% of them were more likely to leave home because of marital problems. 38% were more likely to cheat on their wives. And they were 13% more likely to admit that they hit or hurled things at them. So having a high testosterone male isn't necessarily the best thing, even if it might mean that the kids will be healthier. Now, can women really detect this? Can they really detect high testosterone? And can they just look at those kind of pictures and say, oh, that's a high testosterone male? Well, Roney et al. In 2006 had women look at pics of men who the pictures, they actually knew how high the testosterone levels were of the men in those pictures. So these were pictures that were not manipulated. They were actual pictures of men, the real photograph, but the researcher knew what the men's testosterone levels were. And they found that the men that they rated more masculine were those who actually had higher testosterone. So when women rated how masculine the guy looked, that turned out to be related to the guy's actual testosterone levels. But Roney et al. Also found that women could detect men who enjoyed children more. And this was based on a laboratory test of the men when they were given an infant to play with. And so they're just saying, look at that picture of this guy. Do you think, how likely is it that you think that he would enjoy having children? And it turned out that women could do a good job of this as well. The thing is, those two traits, though, weren't correlated in the men. That is, they're not related to each other. So a man's testosterone levels wasn't related to how much they might enjoy having children. And women didn't really see this as being related to each other as well. So that's kind of an interesting thing. It's kind of arguing that, yeah, maybe women are sensitive to this, but they might also be just sensitive to whether or not this man would be a good father in terms of some characteristics that they're seeing in the face. Another thing to keep in mind about all this stuff about testosterone is that culture may also play a role. Here's a paper that was published in the Proceedings of Biological Sciences back in 2010, the Royal Society, and you can see that it's called The Health of a Nation Predicts Their Mate Preferences, Cross-Cultural Variation in Women's Preferences for Masculized Male Faces by Lisa de Bruin and her colleagues. So there's 4,795 women here in this study in 30 countries, and they're basically given the same task that I've showed you before, where you see two pictures of a male, and they're supposed to indicate which one looks more masculine to you. Okay? So if there is some sort of testosterone effect, that would mean then the higher testosterone, the more masculine faces should be the ones on the left, for instance here, that they would want to pick. So they take these women in all these different countries and they figure out for that country what was the average masculinity preference. Like how much did the women actually prefer a guy who looked like the one on the left versus the one on the right. And so the higher the score would mean that in that country, that was a country where more of the participants, more of these women, would have picked a more masculine face. So that's what's being depicted on the y-axis here, the average masculinity preference. So the higher the number, the more that means that they picked a face that was highly masculine and had high testosterone-looking features. And then the thing on the x-axis is the National Health Index. And what it's showing you there is how good in terms of some United Nations data, that particular country is in terms of providing basic health coverage and health care for its citizens. And the higher the number, the more that country does good job with health care. So the lower countries are the ones that are with like minus 2.5 and minus 2. And you can see there's a negative relationship here that De Bruyn et al. Found, which was that it was those countries that had worse health available for their country were the ones that had more of a preference for a male masculine face. And that the countries that had really good health care, they're the ones that have lower preferences for these highly masculine faces. So that suggests that this preference for a more masculine face is more likely to show itself or to be more important in a context where overall health might be hard to get good health, good care for your children and so on. So there might be more of a preference for looking at features in the face in those kind of countries. In the article that's published in 2010, you can get some of the supplementary data. And one of the things that's kind of cool is you can actually look to see where all the countries are on these measures. And I looked here, and you can see, if you scroll down, that Australia actually was pretty high on this preference. It was a 0.44, and there they are in terms of the health index. It wasn't one of the highest ones necessarily. It was pretty good, but you can see that they still had a little bit more of a preference for male faces. All right, so that's the De Bruyn et al. Study. Let's now talk a little bit more about what is it that actually we like in both male and female faces. Now, these two faces are considered to be very attractive faces in terms of a male and a female face, and they represent sort of very idealized representations of faces. And the idealization comes from some of the features that I've told you already that we know men and women like in each other, in terms of like the men looking more masculine looking, women having big eyes, and so on. But another kind of thing that kind of goes into this is how average looking the person's face is. How much do they deviate from other faces? So the original research back done in the 90s, I guess it was, or late 80s, was they would take faces and morph them together. And so you can see that up on the left, those are 2 faces that have been morphed together. And then we have 4 faces that have been morphed together, and 8 faces, and so on. And so they would show those individual faces to participants and say, how attractive are they, without the participants knowing how many faces have been morphed in there. And what participants generally reported was that they liked the faces that had the most faces averaged into them. So like the 32 faces would be the most attractive because it represents the average of 32 different faces versus the average of just 2 faces in the upper left. So this led to the idea that an average face is the most attractive face. And the less that a particular face deviates from whatever are considered our average looking face, the more we like it. Now, for a long time, that's what people kind of believed. You can see that over on the left here is the average face. And then if you go ahead and take some of those characteristics that we also know are really important to differentiate male and female faces in terms of what people's preferences are from this sort of evolutionary psychology point of view, you can take that average face and kind of push it a little bit more, and you can see this feminized version of that average face on the right. And it turns out that's actually the face that most people find attractive. Some of these characteristics of attractiveness in face has to do with symmetry. So for example, here is our 2 famous people. Denzel Washington is the guy on the left, and then we have Lyle Lovett. Now Lyle Lovett he was a longtime partner of Julia Roberts, and kind of like in that Saturday Night Live video, a lot of people used to think, what in the world is Lyle Lovett doing with Julia Roberts? Because Julia Roberts was so much more attractive than Lyle Lovett. One of the things about Lyle Lovett, you can see in the middle there, that's actually his real face, is the one that's in the middle. He has an asymmetrical face. So you can see that one side of his face looks completely different from the other side of his face. In fact, the face on the right is when they've gone ahead and played with the picture and made it completely symmetrical by making a mirror image of one side of the face to the other side of the face and made it more symmetrical. So people would usually think that the Lyle Lovett on the right is more attractive than the Lyle Lovett on the middle. Turns out Denzel, by the way, who's considered a very attractive male, has a very symmetrical face. Everything is just perfectly lined up in Denzel. Now, symmetry is an indication, like I said, of successful neural development. And it turns out that symmetry also correlates with intelligence and health. And it also predicts actual income and sexual activity. So symmetry becomes a very important thing, as well as averageness and having these hyper male, hyper female characteristics. Symmetry is also a very important sign of attraction, perhaps again because it signifies these other characteristics in people to us. Now, Next thing I want to do is talk about how attractive people are processed in the brain. And this research kind of worked with this hypothesis that perhaps attractive people are rewarding. So this is Yasmin Cloutier and Todd Heatherton, Paul Whalen, and William Kelly at Dartmouth, and it was published in 2008. And so they wanted to see if attractive people are rewarding to our brains just like other things that are attractive. Okay, so here's what they did. They said there's strong evidence that we prefer attractive people over unattractive people. Even infants will spend more time looking at attractive people than unattractive people. There's also evidence that men value physical attraction in the opposite sex more than do women. So what they hypothesize is that they would find sex differences in the brain areas that are active in reward circuits, things like the nucleus accumbens and the OFC, which are both active in drug addiction. So those are areas that, when you're high, you would find more activity in those areas, and they think, well, maybe when you're looking at attractive people, those also would be the areas that would be more active. The participants in this study were 24 men and 24 women who judged the attractiveness of 90 faces of the opposite sex while they were in the scanner. Now, there was no differences between men and women, except for the number of women choosing not attractive at all. So you can see, we're going to see how long it takes for them to make a judgment as the graphs on the top, and then the percentage of participants who picked that the guy was very attractive or very unattractive. You can see that number 4 was not attractive at all, and more women were more likely to use that than men were. Okay, but otherwise, they kind of rated their photographs as being equally attractive. Now, activity in the left and the right nucleus accumbens was greater in the men and the women for more attractive targets. So keep in mind that nucleus accumbens is that area of the brain, it's kind of considered an older part of the brain, that has also been found, for instance, in addiction. You might remember those studies from the 50s where they put electrodes in a rat, and the rat would press a bar and keep getting stimulated in the nucleus accumbens. So this is kind of this area supposedly then is like when we're looking at someone who's attractive, that area is becoming activated, and it's kind of giving ourselves a little high because we're looking at an attractive person. So that's why the physical attractiveness would elicit that kind of activity. The OFC, turned out, was different for attractiveness in the male participants only. So they did find a difference for OFC, but only for male participants, not for the female participants. So that's kind of interesting data from about 10 years ago that's suggesting then that we have an idea that the brain does process attractive faces much like it processes other positive stimuli or rewarding stimuli. And that maybe, again, just like the Hammond et al. Study, there might be some special circuits or special brain areas that men use when they are looking at stimuli like this. One question you could ask, though, is does it really even matter how physically attractive people are? Does it matter in terms of any sort of like long-term happiness in terms of the relationship? And McNulty et al. In 2008 had 82 couples that were within their first 6 months of marriage, and they asked them to complete some questionnaires and also had a 3-hour interaction or interview. And what they found was that the relative difference between the partners' levels of attractiveness appeared to be most important in predicting marital behavior, such that both behaved more positively in relationships in which the wives were more attractive than their husbands, but they behaved more negatively in relationships in which the husbands were more attractive than their wives. So kind of going back to that Saturday Night Live joke, it does look like if the woman is more attractive than the male, that you're going to have a happier relationship than if it is the other way around. So if that's the case, for whatever reason, and you're trying to decide whether or not someone's attractive, you'd want to have this system in your brain that's kind of evaluating attractiveness being pretty accurate for you so that you don't end up making the wrong kind of judgment in terms of the pairing, according to this McNulty et al. Research. Okay, we will talk about how all this kind of plays into love and relationships at the next lecture. The last part of this lecture, though, is I want to go ahead and talk to you about the importance of chemo signals. So this is really changing from the whole idea of attraction to how we're not just talking about the visual system here. We're going to look at how other parts of our interactions with people affect our attraction to them. So this one is about social chemo signals from breastfeeding women, and it was published in 2004 in Hormones and Behavior. So what they did in this study was that they had followed up on some research by McClintock back in 1971, who had found that menstrual synchrony among close friends living together at uni. So you might have heard of this study where 2 women would be paired up sort of at random at the beginning of a university academic year, and now they're roommates. And what would happen is after a few months, their menstrual cycles would become synchronous, so they would actually kind of line up. And they suggested that maybe there were some sort of olfactory cues that were sensitive to the luteal phase in other women, and this is what caused them to kind of line up. It might be some sort of evolutionary function that our ancient ancestors, when they were living in groups, it would have been functional to have all the women on the same menstrual cycle schedule. Okay, that's kind of what they argued back in 1971. Now, in this 2004 study, the hypothesis was that women will be affected by the signals that come from lactation during breastfeeding, such that they would be more likely to want to have sex. So the idea here is that if in our group of women there's a woman who's lactating and she's breastfeeding, she could be sending out signals that other women pick up that cause them want to be more likely to want to have sex. And the Evo explanation here is just that perhaps it's because this is a sort of a signal that this is a safe time in our group of women for us to have sex in order to get pregnant, because it's maybe if one woman's having a child right now, the other woman will be more likely to have a child. They can all help each other out. It might mean that the tribe or our group is actually in a good place right now. We're safe. It's a good time to have offspring. So perhaps these signals that come from lactation, again, would come from our evolutionary past, way long ago. They don't really have much of a function today, but they would still have sort of an effect on women's desires for sex when they can smell or be affected by the lactation of other women. So in this study, what they did is they had cotton pads worn in women who were breastfeeding, and then they put them, like basically after the woman had maybe fed her child and the baby's been put down, then you would go ahead and put this little cotton pad there at the nipples and try to extract some of the residue from the breastfeeding. And then they would apply this under the nose of women who were not pregnant and therefore had no children. And what they did is they would keep doing this, and then they would assess their sexual motivation for the next cycle. And there was also a control group. And believe me, the control group couldn't tell whether or not they had pads that were coming from a breastfeeding woman. There was nothing about the smell or anything else about these little pads that you would know. So the control does not have any more idea, less idea, than the breastfeeding group does about what they're actually smelling underneath their noses. Anyway, what you can see here is that in the we have control versus breastfeeding. So control is the open circles, and breastfeeding is the dark circles. And the main thing, as you can see, is over the number of days of the menstrual cycle. And what we have is the sexual desire. And we have baseline, which means this is before anything has happened. So there's no difference between the control and the breastfeeding during the baseline period. Then in the next thing that happens after the baseline period is you've now started to do the thing where you rub the pads underneath the nose. And you can see that as they go on in the next cycle, that the women who are having the breastfeeding compound put underneath their nose are actually reporting having stronger sexual desires over the next 20 days than the women who are in the control group. And then in the third condition, you can see that they remain high, even though I think now at this point they're no longer getting the compound underneath their nose, and the women who are in the control are still at their same levels. Over on the right, we have the number of sexual fantasies that were reported by these women. The top graph, you can see there's no difference between the control and the breastfeeding women because nothing's been given to them yet. But then you can see that we have in the second chart that we do get a difference there after the LH surge, around the luteal hormone surge, that somewhere around days 25 we get a difference that those women who've had the breastfeeding compound underneath their nose are actually affected in such a way that they have more sexual fantasies, and it stays high now for the next cycle after that. So this is pretty intriguing. It's just saying this little chemo signal, this signal of a scent of a breastfeeding woman is having an effect on other women such that it would increase their sexual desire and their sexual fantasies. And again, the women who are in this study are not aware of what it is that's underneath their nose, so it can't be demand characteristics that would explain it. So it's kind of an interesting effect of how our sexual desire could be affected by other people's behaviors in our group. Now here's one more chemo signal study I want to tell you about. And this is one that was got a lot of attention just a few years ago in 2011, where they looked at human tears as being chemo signals, that perhaps there's something in a tear that you can smell and it affects you, and then that smell, because it gets in through your olfactory system, affects your behavior. So what Gelstein et al. Did was they had women watched some sad films to get them to cry, and then they collected their tears in these little vials, and you can see how they're extracting a tear into that little vial there, and then they go ahead and rub it on, take a little pad and they rub the tear into it, and then they put that underneath the nose of a male, and this male participant now is going to look at some stimuli while he's got that underneath his nose, and now he doesn't know again whether he's got a tear or some saline solution that's just been added to the little pad. The women, by the way, these tears back here were all women who were presenting the tears, so they had women actually doing that part, and then this is men are the actual participants who get the tears underneath their noses. Now, they asked them if they could tell the difference between the saline versus the tears, and the participants could not do that, so that's what graph C is showing you. What you can see next, though, is when they looked at different kinds of stimuli, how they felt. You can see we have a face reading experiment, we have physiological monitoring experiment, we have an fMRI experiment. And basically, we can see that there are some differences here for things like intensity and so on. But here's actually the main thing to point out. So what we're trying to say at this point is that there isn't really a big difference here between the saline and the tears. There's not any kind of known effects that are happening. But we could say, to what extent is this face sad? And so they would look at a face like this and rate how sad it looked. To what extent is this face sexually arousing? Okay, that's another task they did. And this time they did find a difference for the saline versus the tears, such that there was a relationship between after sniffing their tears and how much they sexually rated the stimulus. So after they sniffed the tears, they were more likely to find these pictures sexually arousing, and they weren't likely to find them sexually arousing. So tears actually brought down the overall ratings of sexual arousal they had for those photographs compared to the baseline condition. So we can see that the graph on the left is showing us after sniffing the tears, those two blue bars. You can see that the tears bar is lower than the white bar, and it's showing us in the average amount of rating of sexual arousal that they had for the women that they were rating in those pictures was lower than the baseline condition. In the saline condition, where they're only just smelling saline underneath their noses, you can see that there is no difference between the baseline and the saline in terms of how much they're rating sexually those pictures. So it looks like, from that one set of data there, that the tears cause these men to find these pictures less sexually arousing. In terms of testosterone levels, the other thing that's interesting is they measured their testosterone levels after they had had these tears. And you can see there that, again, the average testosterone level went down when men smelled the tears versus the baseline. The saline had no effect compared to baseline. So the testosterone stayed the same for saline, but for tears it seemed to have dropped. So it seemed to reduce their activation. And so in the fMRI part of the study, they looked at activity in the brain while they looked at pictures. And they found here that, again, that the tears seem to take these areas, and you can see what they're looking at is they're watching an erotic film, and the top graph is the hypothalamus. You remember back in the Hammond et al. Study, they looked at the hypothalamus there. And then you can see that over that time period, in that time period, you can see that the tears causes them to have less activation in the hypothalamus to this erotic stimuli compared to the saline condition. The other thing they have here in E is the graph for the fusiform gyrus, and you can see that these tears are actually reducing activity in the fusiform area as well a bit compared to the saline condition. So what the overall message is that you can get from this article, and by the way, this article is also available as a recommended article if you want to read more of the details of it, is this interesting effect that looks like tears are reducing what men's sexual arousal is, and also the brain activation that might be involved in sexual arousal for looking at an erotic film. That the tears, having that underneath their nose, is somehow inhibiting or reducing their sexual response. And so they say here at the end of their paper, these findings pose many questions. What is the identity of the active compounds in the tears? So that's an interesting question right there. They're saying they have no idea what it is in the tears that's actually causing this to happen. There's no particular chemistry of tears that you could point to and say, oh, this is the reason why sexual desire is going down. All they know at this point is that if it's a tear compared to the saline, they're getting less activation. Then they say, do chemo signals in the women's tears signal anything else but sexual disinterest? And is this signaling restricted to emotional tears only? Moreover, could the emotional or the hormonal state of the crier or the experimenter influence the outcome? In turn, what if any are the signals in men's tears, and what are their effects? Despite these open questions, the current results conclusively demonstrate a chemo signal in human tears. In this, we illustrate a previously unknown functional role for crying. So this is a kind of interesting conclusion, by the way. You know that I also have interests in crying and tears. And so they're kind of arguing here that one of the reasons why we cry in sad times is that we are passing a little chemo signal that gets picked up by the other people around us and it affects their behaviors. Well, whether that's true or not, when the paper got published in 2011, because it was in this major scientific journal, it got a lot of attention around the world. So you can see here, like, women's tears tell men to back off. Women's tears kills men's sex drive. Please don't cry, it upsets a men's sex drive. Tears are a turnoff for men. In women's tears, a chemical that says, not tonight, dear, and study finds what women already knew. So it got a lot of attention because of this chemo signal explanation, and because it was in Nature, I think in particular, a lot of people gave it a lot of credit. But I'll just tell you that not too long ago, in 2017, a paper came out in which they tried to replicate in 3 different studies some of these chemo signal findings of the tears. That is, they went ahead and collected tears from women, put it under males' noses, and tried to replicate a lot of the same effects that you saw in the original Gelstein et al. Article, and they were not able to replicate them. They didn't have an fMRI phase of their study, but they did do things like have them make ratings. They looked at their physiological signals otherwise, and they just did not find any evidence that female tears actually reduced their perceptions of female sexual attractiveness. So it didn't seem to affect sexual arousal, at least in this particular set of studies. So I don't know. I haven't seen the Gelstein et al. Article ever replicated, and the only time it's been attempted to replicate was this one that you see here that was published in Cognition and Emotion in 2017 that argues that you can't replicate this. Now, that concludes my main part of the lecture, and I want to point out to you that there is one more lecture I'd like you to watch. It's a TED Talk again. It's only about 10 to 15 minutes. It's by Tristan Wyatt, and he talks more about pheromones, this whole idea of chemo signals and how they would work. Pheromones is something else that you probably heard about before, and he talks a little bit about what evidence there is for pheromones, how they would work, and so on. So please be sure you watch that one as well. And that's all I have for you this week.